And running. It should be all good. Perfect. Well, welcome back, Chris. Good to speak to you.
Thank you for having me back.
Yeah, no, it's been a while, I think, since we last managed to catch up, just such as the way of kind of like bandwidth during a Premier League season. So I appreciate you coming back on, and what a timely mo moment to have you back on, really. I think given the way in which Newcastle and Liverpool have kind of intersected over the past number of months, and especially over the transfer window, which we will be avoiding for as long as we can, or to sort of leave that section for the latter half of the pod. But what I wanted to sort of begin with really is that the high point of the end of last season with the Carabao Cup final win and of course the qualification for the Champions League as well. Just to get your thoughts on how Newcastle had negotiated that campaign, which was at times quite difficult, and I think it took a bit of time to find their feet. But when they did, the consistency that they showed was remarkable. So yeah, just a little bit about your kind of thoughts when that final whistle went on the final game of last season.
Yeah, it feels like it was a lifetime ago, really, even though it was just a few months ago, because so much has happened. I mean, you mentioned last season. Last season was an epic, and it started with Newcastle actually won quite a few games early on, but unconvincingly, and went on a very inconsistent run up till the sort of start of December. And then Sandro Tonali shifted to be the number six, and from that point on, Newcastle's form was basically almost neck and neck with Liverpool in the league, and obviously they went on to claim their historic Carabao Cup with a victory in the final against Liverpool. But up until that point, it was just you could see that Eddie Howe had built an elite side really on the field. Newcastle are still trailing the very biggest clubs in so many areas, commercially, financially, in terms of what they can actually spend due to PSR, in terms of infrastructure and the like. But actually, on the field, they have been competing over the last few years. And once they found the rhythm last year, that they really did go on a roll, and it felt like that was going to culminate in the Carabao Cup final, which was Newcastle's first piece of domestic silverware in 70 years, their first major trophy of any form since 1969, and they went to Wembley against Liverpool, who were the significant favourites, and in my opinion, massively deserved to win that game. They went toe to toe and really disrupted Liverpool. Could and should have put it to bed sooner, really, and then that felt like a massive moment in the modern history of the club. And it was from that stage, it wouldn't really have surprised you if then the focus had maybe shifted off the league and Newcastle was still some way off even being in the Champions League positions, never mind securing them by that stage. But actually, they used that as a motivational tool. That they then had massive celebrations in the centre of Newcastle. I was there, a place in the middle of town, or just outside the middle of town, called the Town Moor, and there were sort of hundreds of thousand people lined the streets, and then we're at the parade, and that fueled Newcastle to go onwards. They knew as a group of players that wasn't the be all and end all for them. It was huge, but actually what they wanted to do was secure Champions League football, and they went on a really good run with 3 games to go, looked like they were in a comfortable position. Then went to Arsenal and lost. And then the final day of the season really actually should have, if Villa had done their job against Manchester United, then actually Newcastle would have missed out. But given what Newcastle had done up to that point, it was a nervy final day, but they had the success of fifth place, which we know that last year, because of the coefficient, meant an extra Champions League place. And it was huge for them because I was of the opinion they needed to win a trophy because they needed to get that sort of monkey off their back in this era. But actually, in a world governed by how much money you can spend due to what you generate, Newcastle need Champions League football. They also need the prestige of that for players and for potentially keeping hold of some players, even if maybe some on still don't want to stay, even despite that. And so I think it was very, very impressive, and it shows really the job that Eddie Howe and his coaching staff have done, but also these players and the sort of character they have and belief they now have that they deserve to be where they are, and really it's a huge success. And going in this year, hopefully they can make more of a fist of the Champions League, and it should be set up a little bit more with the newer format for Newcastle to hopefully progress further.
Yeah, absolutely. Just don't win the league phase. It seemingly means you draw the hardest team in the competition. Yeah, I think I don't want to gloss over it. I think actually in terms of sort of the work that Eddie Howe has done at Newcastle, I mean, I think when I look at the signings from outside in, yes, you can see the quality of some of the players that have come in, but I think there's other players there who he's got the absolute maximum out of them, despite perhaps them not being the same level as like Guimaraes, for example, and some of the others, the real stars of Newcastle's team. And the some of the hallmarks that I've come to associate with Newcastle, and that was part of the reason why I was dreading the Carabao Cup game a little bit, was you could sort of sense that Liverpool physically were kind of starting to to gas out a little bit towards the end of towards that point in the season, certainly. And knowing what Newcastle can do, and knowing sort of the physicality that a number of those players can bring. Tonali, you mentioned there, I think Joe Linton, Guimaraes, a whole number of them. I was fearful of getting bullied across the pitch, and I think you're right. I think you won't hear a different kind of perception of that game from me. I thought it was thoroughly deserved that Newcastle won that. I think the only thing in my mind I even remember from that game was like a Trippier kind of like awkward handball, and then Chiesa getting a goal, but it meaning nothing. Was probably the only things that I remembered from it. But no, I thought thoroughly deserved and kind of outplayed Liverpool across the pitch. So I mean, at that point, and with the Champions League qualification, as you mentioned, as that bonus, I think on paper you would have thought, okay, this is the point to kick on. This is the point to really, to have a thorough transfer plan in place, to have off the pitch kind of like plans in place to sort of make it clear that this project is moving forward. It's stepping up a level, as you mentioned there, to convince players who are already at the club, but also to convince like recruits, and also just just show that Newcastle have made that next step. In terms of like the things you thought needed to be addressed on and off the pitch, and again, we're avoiding the elephant in the room here for as long as we can. But in terms of you can mention other positions that you think maybe Newcastle needed to be having a look at, but also some of the off the pitch work that perhaps needed to be done. 'Cause I think that's probably come more into the limelight this season in terms of maybe positions that haven't been filled necessarily. What were your thoughts on kind of what Newcastle needed to have done at that point?
I mean, just to expand further on last season, I probably should have mentioned this then, but one of the reasons why it was the achievements was so massive was because Newcastle had a very destabilizing summer last year.
Right. Yeah.
Due to the PSR issues that they had, before June 30th, 2024, they were in a mad rush to try and sell players. It was obviously nearly Anthony Gordon to Liverpool. That was something that was floated, and in the end, they had to sell Elliot Anderson and Yankuba Minter for a combined 65 million. They had to sign a goalkeeper for 20 million and Odysseus Vlachodimos, who has only played once and is now out on loan in Sevilla, with Newcastle paying the majority of his wages. But also during that summer, Amanda Staveley, who was a minority shareholder but was basically the public face post takeover, left as one of the co-owners, and also Paul Mitchell arrived as sporting director, and it was a very turbulent summer. Eddie Howe was disrupted. He gave a very honest press conference and first one of the summer last year in Germany when Newcastle were Adidas HQ, and it felt like there was an actual genuine chance that he may end up leaving. But anyway, to cut a long story short, Newcastle didn't actually strengthen their first 11 last year. They couldn't for PSR issues. They actually went 3 windows before this without strengthening, so they needed to do a heck of a lot of work going into this summer. And the last thing they needed was another disruption off the field, but they'd already had the very unfortunate situation that their CEO Darren Eales at the end of September announced that he had a chronic form of blood cancer and was going to have to leave. But his notice is still being served. Newcastle are yet to replace him as CEO, or that should change imminently. That's not been ideal. That everyone knows he's been leaving. And then sporting director wise, Paul Mitchell announces just a few days after the end of the season that he is also going to leave his position, and then that was from June the 30th. So Newcastle went in the window needing to do a heck of a lot of business,
Mm.
and without sort of two crucial people at the very top of the club. And so instead, there's been an interim transfer committee of some very talented members of staff, but who have had to operate essentially above what the normal pay grade has been. And really, the first part of the summer was very difficult. Newcastle went for a lot of players and didn't get them. Brian Mbeumo was their top right wing target, but Manchester United
Mm.
was his preference, and so Newcastle didn't actually end up making a bid for him. They were interested in Liam Delap, one of the many clubs who would have exercised his release clause that they could have done, and he chose Chelsea.
Mm.
They also even threw the hat in the ring for Dean Huijsen. It was always going to be ambitious, but he ends up going to Real Madrid. And then the 4 players have actually bid for and have been rejected by, in terms of those bids have actually made, or James Trafford, who for a long period of time they thought was going to be their goalkeeper. They'd bid from last year as well, but Man City had the ability to match a bid that was accepted, and they did that. And then James Trafford chose them. Newcastle went for João Pedro at Brighton, and he chose Chelsea. Newcastle also went for, I'm just trying to remember all these players here because you just lose. So Hugo Ekitike, who they tried to beat Liverpool to, obviously, and felt that they were in a good position to do so. And then Liverpool gazumped them for him. And then latterly, Benjamin Šeško, who they always really felt wanted Manchester United, but they pushed really hard for that, tried to convince him to come, and that didn't happen. So Newcastle have suffered many knockbacks this window, and that has been criticised for in some parts. People suggesting have they had the wrong set of transfer targets. I get that to a certain degree, and from some of the players, I think probably with João Pedro and maybe even Hugo Ekitike, you can argue they were maybe led up the garden path and they should have moved on earlier or shouldn't have gone for them in the first place. But I also think Newcastle are operating in a sort of a difficult space between whereas previously when they signed players like Bruno Guimaraes and Sandro Tonali, they immediately improved the first 11 they had. For now, Newcastle now to do that, it's more difficult. And to do so, they tend to be competing with the established elite clubs who can either offer more money, have more cachet and sort of historical grandeur. All of those clubs have missed out on there. It's not like they've gone for a player and then they've signed for Everton instead of Newcastle. No disrespect to Everton, I'm sure that Liverpool fans will appreciate that though. But they've gone to Real Madrid or they've gone to Chelsea or they've gone to Liverpool or they've gone to Manchester United, and it might not be the Manchester United on-field success of old, but they're still Manchester United.
Mm.
And so it's been difficult in that regard. And actually, as the window has gone on, Newcastle have spent quite a lot of money, but I think they've addressed some key areas. They needed and wanted an upgrade at right wing for 3 years and hadn't done so. They missed out on Mbeumo, but went quickly back for a target they'd already gone for last year and who they really liked, and Anthony Elanga.
Yeah.
Spent a lot of money for him, but I think his raw attributes, that pace that he has, and he's 2-footed, and I think he will improve under Eddie Howe, and that's the key to every single player Newcastle has signed is that they will continue to improve under Eddie Howe. So they've addressed that long-term problem position. They've addressed another long-term problem position at right-sided centre back. They've wanted a successor to Fabian Schär. They've signed Malik Chow. Marquee they went for last year. They haven't gone back in from this year because they knew his preference was to go elsewhere. And so they've gone for Malik Chow, who again, 24, has room for improvement, but has all of the raw attributes to hopefully be a big success. I've just completed the signing of Jacob Ramsey as a midfielder. He brings the midfield cohort back up to 6, which is what Eddie Howe wants to compete on all fronts. He plays with 3 midfielders. Will he get immediately into the starting trio ahead of the starting trio of Joe Linton, Sandro Tonali, and Bruno Guimaraes? Possibly not, but he's very good competition for them. Will also be able to be used in other competitions, and he is an upgrade and is younger than Sean Longstaff, who has left this summer, who was a wonderful servant, improved massively under Eddie Howe, but the time felt right for him to move on. And then the fourth signing they've made has also been a goalkeeper in Aaron Ramsdale, who they pivoted to after missing out on James Trafford. It's a loan with an option to buy, so that if he does really well, Newcastle can sign and bring him in. Otherwise, they've given themselves another year to really reassess post Trafford what they want to do. The big elephant in the room beyond Alexander Isak for Newcastle remains the fact that they haven't replaced Callum Wilson at centre forward. So the Isak situation has been exacerbated by the fact that Newcastle spent most of pre-season playing Will Osula, who's never started a Premier League match for them, through the middle, and then Anthony Gordon has started as a sort of central striker, false nine, in the first game of the season at Aston Villa. And Newcastle's glaring lack of killer instinct in the box was there at Villa Park. They probably should have won, but didn't, and they didn't have a striker on the pitch. So that is the window will ultimately be judged on both Isak and what happens up front. But if Newcastle can sign a striker and keep Isak and actually get him sort of half motivated again, I'd say largely in a roundabout way, this looks like it's on course to have been a tumultuous but actually potentially pretty successful window.
Yeah, it does feel as though so much is riding up on how it kind of concludes, doesn't it? In terms of sort of like these final few moves or lack of moves. And I think one thing that actually when I was asking some of the listeners about questions to maybe pose to you, one was actually around that departure of Paul Mitchell and sort of understanding a bit more about what happened there, about sort of why he decided to leave the club at that point. I mean, clearly, I think Liverpool have seen in the past, other clubs have seen in the past, where there is that sort of level of disruption. It doesn't matter if you have a really talented group of people, as you mentioned, who are working on the transfer targets. That kind of lack of direction and sort of strategy from above and actually sort of that having that pedigree in negotiations can be really disruptive. What were some of the reasons behind kind of why Paul Mitchell actually ended up leaving the club, or was that not necessarily known?
Well, I think it is known now, but I mean, there's you've got to sort of add two and two together and potentially make five, but I think you make four in the end. I mean, some people immediately rushed to the announcement when Paul Mitchell was leaving that this was like a victory for Eddie Howe,
Yeah.
that the two of them had clashed from the start and that Howe wanted him to go. Now, they were certainly not the best of bedfellows, but relationships had improved, certainly in terms of in a working relationship manner over the course of last year. And the last thing that Eddie Howe wanted going into such an important summer was to lose the man who was going to be in charge of the negotiating strategy. And certainly at the last moment, Howe knew it was the direction of travel, but he thought that Mitchell was going to be there for the remainder of the window. So when he went, it was actually very disruptive for Howe. So when people were calling it a victory, I'd have said it was a bit of a Pyrrhic victory because it wasn't what he wanted. What he wanted was players, and he needed his sporting director there for it. But when Mitchell had come in, he had actually planned initially to spend longer out with his family. He'd been in Europe for quite a few years, but Newcastle had come calling, and basically Darren Eales, who I mentioned earlier, the CEO, um, who he worked with briefly at Spurs, was someone he had a long-term relationship with, and it was Eales who he agreed to come in with. And Mitchell is I think it's fair to say that he's a bit of a combative character, and he's someone who relationships are very important with him, particularly the person he works under. And to give one example, when he was at Tottenham Hotspur, eventually he ended up leaving, serving out his notice because he clashed with Daniel Levy, and it sort of became irreconcilable. So for him to be working under Darren Eales and then knowing Eales was leaving, I think that significantly contributed to his decision. He didn't know who the replacement CEO was going to be, so he didn't know who he was going to be working under. And I also think that he has not said this, but this is my supposition. I think he probably came to the conclusion that after the season of success Newcastle had last year, having tried to pivot about 12, 18 months ago to maybe more of what you would call a sort of modern transfer model of it being a bit more collaborative and the sporting director maybe even leading a little bit more than the head coach, because Eddie Howe has had such success that maybe he always felt that this wasn't necessarily going to be the full Paul Mitchell project, and so therefore that maybe hastened his departure. As I say, that's partly supposition, but I think all of those things ultimately contribute to it. But it left Eddie Howe in a very difficult position. Newcastle have Steve Nixon, who's the head of recruitment, but also the assistant head of recruitment is Andy Howe, who is who is Eddie Howe's nephew, and has worked with him for a long period of time, very highly regarded in the scouting sphere, and he has actually been overseeing a lot of Newcastle's recruitment this summer. And so in the end, it seems like they've managed to get some pretty good deals done. But to have done that in the environment where you were just thrust into it very last minute, without, as you mentioned, the experience of negotiating, without that sort of seniority above or those historic relationships necessarily on negotiating front, and then having to deal on top of that with the cloud of Alexander Isak hanging over the entire summer. It very much has been someone being thrown into the deep end. But as I say, with a fortnight left in the window, it looks like they maybe actually are on course to more than salvaging it, and they may be actually coming out of it with a squad which in many areas looks substantially stronger. But that's with the massive asterisks of up front right now.
Yeah, and I think as you mentioned there, I mean, there's only so much you can know definitively. That there is always that sort of reading between the lines, and I'm thinking comparatively to situations at Liverpool in the past as well. I think much was made. I think when Rodgers was manager here about kind of like the disquiet between him and the transfer committee. I remember reading. Oh, I always love that quote. There's a quote I read once around. I think it's something like laptop nerds in air-conditioned rooms or something like that. It's just a wonderful quote about like, which probably describes actually the vast majority of transfer committees at Premier League clubs now. I don't know about the air conditioning, but that setup is more and more common nowadays, and certainly the Michael Edwards return to Liverpool post Klopp's departure, I don't think was any coincidence, to be honest. I think that a similar thing may have happened at Liverpool where Klopp, understandably got more and more influence, more and more control
Yeah.
after the success, and Michael Edwards decided it was time for him to leave, and then coming back at a moment where he would have that chance to sort of fill that vacuum. I don't think is a coincidence, but one other point there as well. I mean, around replacing the director of football role, I guess that's one for post summer at this stage. Obviously, sort of the focus is the transfer targets. But do you think, I mean, given what happened with Dan Ashworth and sort of his career trajectory, sort of like following his departure, I mean, do you think there's any sort of world in which the club would go back for sort of discussions with him, or do you think that's really remains to be seen in, or Howe's position at the moment makes it a bit more difficult?
Yeah, I think that ship sailed. I mean, he's back at the FA, but also I think the way that he left, there were
That
people
was
at
still.
Newcastle who felt quite burned by the fact that he ended up going to Manchester United, but also for a good few months he'd been in talks with them. It emerged afterwards, and he'd sort of almost denied that behind the scenes. Newcastle have been going through a process of looking at the next director of football. The two who we believe got the final stages with Jason Nato, who was
Okay.
uh, interim at Arsenal as director of football, and then also Ross Wilson, who is I think chief football officer is his position at Nottingham Forest right now, and we understand that Ross Wilson is the favourite, and we think that is likely to happen. He has a past relationship with Howe, and we think that he's interested in the role. So it looks like that may be the next direction of travel. And what's key, and I asked Eddie Howe about this before the Villa game on Saturday, asking him about the sort of disruption of not having a sporting director. But what's key for Newcastle is that going forward, they have a sporting director who comes in and actually stays long term. They've burned through two in the last 18 months, and it's meant to be a long term position. It's meant to be the person who sets that sort of vision and strategy going forward. And that's what Newcastle need. They need someone who's going to come in and actually see it through, really, because otherwise it can be very disruptive if someone comes in and starts changing things.
And again, sort of pirouetting, dancing around the elephant in the room around Alexander Isak. I just wanted to talk about preseason in general, how that preseason tour went. Obviously, understanding sort of like the main tactical issue has been obviously sort of figuring out what to do at centre forward with the departure of Callum Wilson with Isak's situation. But in terms of what you think Howe wanted from that preseason tour, and also kind of how robust the squad feels in terms of this season will be more intense than last season, of course, with the Champions League football now to contend with as well. What do you think was sort of like the main focal points of that preseason tour, and sort of like how successful it ended up being for Howe, because it always can be a bit of a balancing act for clubs.
It's impossible to dance around the issue any more than the fact that
Yeah,
it was that
of
it
course.
was heavily influenced by Alexander Isak. Newcastle had a behind closed doors preseason match against Carlisle United, which they won 4-0. But then beyond that, they didn't win a single one of their six friendlies, which were played in front of crowds. First one was up at Celtic Park, which I went to, and they'd been in Austria that week, where Isak had been out training with them. And then the big talking point was that Alexander Isak is not at Celtic Park now. Newcastle said that was partly fitness enforced, but also due to the noise that was around Alexander Isak. Newcastle went on to lose 4-0. It was a side which was a bit of an alarming result, but it was also a team who that week had done fairly intense training, and they were also
Yeah.
2 weeks behind Celtic in terms of development. But then later that week, on the Thursday, they flew out to East Asia. I was there for the first part of the East Asia tour in Singapore, but all the talk was about the person who was not on the plane. That was Alexander Isak, and basically it caught Newcastle a little bit on the hop when they were flying across first to Dubai, and then they were refueling that sort of the stories then emerged about him wanting to leave or wanting to explore the possibility of leaving. They'd said he hadn't gone due to a thigh problem, which they still maintain, and was what he'd said to them. But it was also his decision not to go. And then in those first few days in Singapore, Eddie Howe, who is rarely unflustered, is usually so in control. You could tell that all of it, they just knew that this was just all the focus now was on not the people who were in East Asia trying to promote Newcastle's brand there, but actually the person who was back in the northeast of England and who hadn't travelled. And so Eddie Howe gave a press conference in which he gave an answer, and it looked like he'd finished. Everyone in the room thought he finished. The press officer went to bring in the next questioner, and then Eddie Howe suddenly just jumped in and said, "Oh, we're not distracted by the situation." He introduced the word "distracted" into the room, and then subsequently has used it in um, far more in a lot more context in terms of just basically saying, yeah, a lot of the players have been distracted by the situation of not being there. And so basically, Newcastle there in Singapore lost to Arsenal in Singapore. Then they went to South Korea, lost to a Korea Select 11. Then they also drew with Spurs. And they gradually got better towards the back end of pre-season. They had two games inside 24 hours at St James's Park, Cella Weekender before the start of the season. They drew with Espanyol and then lost to Atletico Madrid. And you could see elements of what they were doing well, but equally the big problem was at centre
Mhm.
forward, and that has seeped into the season now because they also most of their signings have only arrived in the last few weeks of the week. So they had Anthony Elanga basically from the start of preseason, but the rest of them haven't arrived till later on. So depth had looked like it was going to be an issue, whereas now everywhere across the pitch, just about, they look like they have options. They look like they have stronger depth than they did previously, and so that not quite you could select two 11s and certainly not up front, but you can certainly have a good group of 17, 18 players there, and you could have on the bench, you can have options, and it should be more robust in terms of being able to rotate, but also if someone gets injured, an option coming in. But the problem is just that up front, that because Wilson has gone and Will Asula is just still looks so raw. Looks like he has all the attributes, but just doesn't quite know how to put them all together yet and really get the best out of himself. And then Sean Neve, who's an 18-year-old academy graduate who they really like, but he's just not yet ready. He was coming on some of the preseason matches. So that's where the problem's been, because then you've had to play square pegs and round holes. So then Anthony Gordon has
Yeah.
gone into centre forward. And then so that actually makes it look like you've got fewer wide options than you would do if you had a centre forward. So it all comes back to that one big issue up front, and whereas the rest of the squad is looking stronger, and they've basically done all of the rest of the business that they wanted to do other than in the centre forward position.
Yeah, so I think yeah, I think you're right to push me on that, and that I was unavoidable to dance around it anymore. But I think, I mean, sort of beginning that conversation, then I mean, I think actually, yeah, the timeline of events that you sort of mentioned there is really helpful to kind of contextualize just how disruptive it was to preseason and has been up until now as well. It'd be interesting. Maybe I'll give my kind of perception of it. I've tried to read as much as I can about sort of what's been going on. It's obviously quite difficult to sort of, well, especially these days, to sort of be confident that you're verifying the information you're seeing around it, especially when it comes to transfer stories. It's always been difficult. But the perception I've got from reading the various reports on it, including, of course, those from David Ornstein at The Athletic and yourselves, has been that, well, and correct me if I'm wrong here, that Alexander Isak is reported to have informed Newcastle at the beginning of last season that that he would like to or intended to leave in the summer, obviously under contract, and we'll come back to that as a big point of discussion. And then a few weeks prior to the end of the season, he had reiterated kind of that that would be his desire to move on. At that stage, I think based on what you've mentioned there already, even before some of this really came out publicly, I think it seemed pretty clear that Newcastle were looking for more attacking options. Callum Wilson leaving, of course, there was a desire to reinforce in that position. Just starting off, then, I just wanted to ask you: is that understanding of the situation correct as far as we know in terms of the player actually making his desire known that early to the club, as opposed to what it seemed like at the moment when you mentioned Eddie Howe in that press conference on the preseason tour, where it suddenly catches everybody off guard that he's made this decision. Just anything on that, basically, to
I mean, to give people a snapshot into, and this is not to try and make people sympathetic or empathetic towards journalists who are trying to cover transfer stories, but this is sort of a classic and very extreme example of you speak to one side and you get one set of truths, and you speak to another and you get others. So that's the Alexander Isak's camp maintain that was the case. You speak to
Okay.
people at Newcastle, and they suggest that they were always under the impression, and that their conversations with Isak is that they were going to sit down and talk about a new contract this summer, and that he was open to that, and he understood the situation, because basically the background to this is that previous ownership had suggested to Isak that,
Yeah.
by that I mean Amanda Stave, that he might get, or they would discuss with him a new contract, which would see a pay bump. But all the PSR issues I mentioned before, when Paul Mitchell arrived as sporting director, the view was at that point Alexander Isak has 4 years left in his contract. We have to rein in spending in some ways if we're going to comply with PSR. Yes, Isak has been brilliant and has delivered for us, but he's already one of our highest earners. Can we really, at this point, be renegotiating his contract and the potential knock-on effects of that? He was hurt by that, or wasn't particularly impressed by that, but Newcastle maintained that throughout most of last season it wasn't the case that he was definitively leaving, and
Okay.
that it sort of all erupted this summer. Now, in terms of Newcastle looking for another striker, there's been some suggestions over the last couple of weeks that all summer Newcastle's plan has been that they were going to bring in two. Now, again, that seems to be maybe a little bit of revisionism coming in there, because the plan was for João Pedro was that he was going to be someone who could dovetail
Yeah.
with Isak, and then same with Hugo Ekitike. Now at that point it seemed that the things were changing a slightly, but also Newcastle maintained that Alexander Isak was not for sale and that Hugo Ekitike was going to play alongside him. I think that was also succession planning for the acceptance Newcastle had that maybe in a year's time it would have been that Isak had to go, whether that was he signed a new contract in the meantime with a release clause and then left, or he just did go at some point next year, and that Ekitike could potentially succeed him. And I actually think one of the things that really actually inflamed the situation and maybe forced Isak into a position where he's a bit more militant was Liverpool jumping in and signing Ekitike. If they hadn't signed Ekitike, then Isak may have seen it as in there was a clearer pathway to go to Liverpool, but I think once they were actually trying to sign another striker, and this is supposition on my part, but it just the timing sort of works. It was when Newcastle were out in Austria at that point they were trying to, and Isak was there and was fine, and then suddenly Ekitike is not coming to Newcastle anymore. He's joining Liverpool, and suddenly are they going to sign him? And they also going to come in and spend 150 million pound on another centre forward? It always seemed unlikely that those two things would happen together, and so in a perverse sort of way, if that is true, then Liverpool by signing Ekitike have probably harmed their chances of then subsequently signing Isak because Newcastle, if they were going to let Isak go, definitely needed a top class replacement. Sesko was different because Sesko came after that, and I think Sesko was an attempt to, if we do sign him, then there probably is a pathway for Isak to go to Liverpool here because we've signed a top class replacement. They always felt. I remember having conversations with people before just as the Ekitike deal was collapsing, but before Newcastle really pushed for Sheshko, and they were like, we really like Sheshko, we try to sign him, and before they signed Isak in 2022, but we don't think there's really any chance there. We think he wants to go to Manchester United. We think we'll be beaten on sort of wages, on costs, and all the like. But actually, they ended up then pushing really hard for him because the situation had changed, and it seemed like that they had to at least be seen to be doing something which would potentially facilitate Isak's exit. I think at this stage it's similar. Newcastle are still looking around, but if they're going to let Isak leave, they've maintained all along that he's not for sale. The board have maintained that all along, and various people inside the club. But basically, the only caveat they give is we'd need to sign two strikers because of the Callum Wilson situation. Someone like Johan Visser was always.
Yeah.
He was actually a backup to previous options they'd gone for, the other ones I mentioned, but then he was always in negotiations. I've even said this: you would be the Callum Wilson replacement. It would be to play alongside Isak or dovetail with Isak. Whereas subsequently they've looked at other forwards, but Newcastle only want to let him leave if they get close to 150 million valuation and sign two forwards, but one of whom they believe to be ready to play in the Champions League. They've looked at a lot of other centre forwards, and there would have even been a calculated gamble in signing someone like Benjamin Šeško or Hugo Ekitike, but they had more confidence in that than they do in a lot of the other forwards. They've looked at Samu at Porto. He would cost a lot of money, and they like certain parts of what he would do, but he's raw in so many ways. He's not yet ready, they believe, or seemingly believe, to be doing that at the top level. And so it just looks like Newcastle's options are so slim
Mm.
that a lot of people in the club even say that a disinterested Alexander Isak and even a sulky Alexander Isak, if you can get him back on the pitch, is better than the potential options that they could actually get in the final fortnight of the window. Now I say that with still 2 weeks to go, and who knows how quickly these things can change. But as things stand, and I've been in this for probably 10 days, 2 weeks, I think I'm about 70-30 that Isak stays just because I don't see all of those eventualities coming to pass. There isn't really an ideal exit route for Newcastle here. They either have an Isak who, unless there's a massive vault face, is going to be frustrated and wanted his move away, and really his relationship with Newcastle fans is never going to be what it was before. It already feels to a certain degree irreconcilable. But Eddie Howe has been clear not to burn any bridges there, and he's always tried to give Isak an exit route in all capacities in terms of coming back into the squad. He hasn't overtly criticised him, while at the same time maintaining he needs players who wants to be here. But if they were to decide that they were going to let Isak go, it would be a massive gamble because whoever they bring in, unless they suddenly find that someone's become available who they've wanted for a long period of time, they're probably going to have to spend a heck of a lot of money on someone they're not yet convinced definitely is going to be anything close to Isak long term. Because the reason why this situation has unfolded is Alexander Isak is unique. You don't get a like for Alexander Isak, so Newcastle would have to find a creative alternative solution. But whether that is good enough for a campaign where they're going back into the Champions League and they want to have the same success in the league and domestic cups again, you have to say it almost certainly won't be.
Yeah, it's been interesting, I think, and thanks for laying that, all of that out there. I mean, I think the timing of the public interest in Isak was intriguing to me. Around it seemed as though there was that inquiry, and maybe an initial bid or initial kind of inquiry to Newcastle around the time, obviously, but then suddenly sort of the interest in Ekatike emerged as well. The Ekatike thing to me almost felt similar to I think the Luis Diaz signing actually a number of seasons ago, where there was nothing on that deal whatsoever, and then there was public knowledge that Tottenham were interested in signing Luis Diaz, and then I just, in my mind, some buzzer went off somewhere that like a potential target that maybe Liverpool were thinking about for the summer had been was potentially about to be taken off the market, and Liverpool moved. And in a weird way, that's how I sort of ended up viewing Ekitike. I think some people do kind of underestimate sort of, I think, Liverpool's need to get multiple forwards in. I mean, first of all, their comfort in letting the likes of Luis Diaz go, the likes of Darwin Nunez go. Seems like they're going to sell Javier. Seems like that. Ben Doak, even a youngster. Some of the other players around the periphery have left, and of course, the like that horrible passing of Diego Jota as well, meaning that they need to invest in this area. So the Ekitike thing, the timing of that felt strange. Um, Similarly, I think this emphatic stance that seems to have been made by Isak's camp around, no intention, of reintegrating, no intention of playing, not being involved in the squad, coming on a tour, training at the Real Sociedad camp for a period of time as well. I have to admit, I've been quite surprised at just how emphatic that seems to have been from the players' side. That it does, obviously, and you mentioned briefing both sides, which one is true, but it that certainly does point towards the fact that there's a perception that promises have been had been broken or whatever by previous regimes. The crude, I mean, so the crude appearance on the online Liverpool circles, for example, is Ouattara's joining Brentford, so that means Vissa and Newcastle will that will be agreed imminently, and then Vissa joins, and then there's a pathway. But I mean, we've had this discussion. I've always sort of thought in my mind, there's no way Vissa joins, and then Newcastle suddenly put the thumbs up and go, "That's fine. He'll replace Isak. Here's Isak. Please negotiate." It's always in my mind. I thought that there needs to be that high profile signing, like you mentioned, Sheshko, the likes of Ekitike, ironically. The only question I've had in my mind is just the extent to which Isak has seemingly gone about trying to burn bridges. It seems like, just to sort of make that position untenable, to force the move. You mentioned some of the chants coming out of, well, you didn't mention them, but sort of alluded to some of the chants coming out of the Newcastle end in the Villa game towards Isak. I'm long enough in the tooth to know that footballers who want to leave and then rejoin the squad and score 20 goals, it's everything is forgotten very, very quickly. I'm reminded of Suarez and his desire to go to Arsenal. So I suppose in my head as well, always kind of been thinking about the potential for, if Isak is still adamant, an agreement that would then come later, or even, I don't think Newcastle would sanction a January release, but it does feel as though at the moment so much is up in the air, and just about Howell's confidence in being able to reintegrate Isak. Other than Vissa, though, I mean, in terms of targets, I've not heard about anybody really who Newcastle are looking at to maybe fill that void. Have there been any names that have come up since the Seshko deal didn't materialize?
I mean, just to clarify, so on the Vissa and Ouattara
Yes.
going to Brentford situation, I mean that is uh
2 + 2 =
no,
6.
no, yeah, two and two makes five because actually Ouattara is the Mbeumo replacement,
Yes.
and
Yeah, yeah.
Brentford wants somebody else in, or certainly Newcastle, as things stand, haven't met Brentford's valuation either.
Right.
Vissa's 28, Newcastle believe he's worth about 30 to 35 million. Brentford would like more given how valuable he is to them. And obviously, Brentford have had a lot of players picked off this summer. So, and Vissa's gone about things in a similar sort of way to Isak. There's parallels there in terms of, do you have to question? I mean, in one sense, it shows his determination and desire to play for Newcastle, but at the same time, it's like, is that the best luck to have done what he has sort of done, and he wasn't involved for Brentford at Forest at the weekend. In terms of other strikers, they're like Strand Larson at Wolves, but again, they would need a replacement. How much would he cost? And he looks more like the sort of Callum Wilson replacement than necessarily a replacement for Alexander Isak, unless Newcastle just decide we sign a couple of players for now and then really assess next summer if we just feel Isak has to go. I think that it feels like Alexander Isak will have to have left Newcastle by this point next year. I understand that when you're in the heat of the moment, that as you mentioned, the Suarez situation and things can change over time, but it's difficult to see that Newcastle and Alexander Isak will still be united at this point next year. I think that it could be that he goes in the next 2 weeks, but Eddie Howe has been determined to leave open every single door for him to still be involved, and he hasn't criticised him publicly. He's really toed the line very, very well and held that very, very well. It's all about unity in Newcastle at the minute, and it was no coincidence that over the weekend, every player who was interviewed before and after the game spoke about the fact that it's about the players who are here and now. We're united. We're a very close knit group, and it's not about one individual. And actually, the fans themselves, the chants during the game, there weren't any chants. It was sort of afterwards as the players started to walk away. There was then stuff about there being one greedy Bastard, and there was also some chants about Isak doesn't want us, we don't want him, and so that was just from a select few. The second one was from a select few bunch
Sure.
fans who were leaving, but it feels that this is not going to go away by deadline. Certainly, it's not going to go away by the time Newcastle play Liverpool on Monday night. I can't see how there's a resolution either way before that. It wouldn't make sense really for either club to come to that resolution.
Yeah.
But if Isak was to leave, then Newcastle would be taking a huge gamble. And even if they're signing a couple of players between now and then, I think they've basically scoured the market. And you've asked about other alternatives. They basically have decided that there aren't really the ones certainly who are available. Who they're like Ollie Watkins at Villa, but again, he would cost a lot of money. They've also already just signed a player from Villa, and do they really want to aid Villa's PSR position, a direct rival, even more than they currently have by signing Ollie Watkins and then potentially letting Villa sign other players? As age is also an issue for them in terms of sanctioning and signing that high. Samu, as I mentioned before, Porto, Gonçalo Ramos at PSG has been put their way, and they do like him, but again, he's on big wages and he'd be a big fee. That would probably be if Isak went, but again, they're not necessarily convinced he's exactly like for like there either. So I think that it's a very small pool of strikers as it is. Everyone seems to want a striker this summer. Costs are and prices are even more inflated than ever before. So as I said earlier, I just as things stand right here at this very moment, I struggle to see how the eventualities that come to pass, which Newcastle insist and have insisted throughout, unless Newcastle buckle and relent on that front and say, right, we get Visser through the door or Strand Larson through the door, and we gamble up until January on having them plus Gordon as a backup centre forward and then Will Asuda as a sort of third one. That would be a huge gamble on all those fronts. But if they feel that that releases some of the toxicity that may linger on if Alexander Isak stays, I suppose there is that possibility. But I think in all likelihood at the moment, it is looking like it's going to be a sort of unhappy marriage of inconvenience which continues between Newcastle and Isak beyond September the 1st.
Yeah, I mean that certainly seems like it's Isak Camp's only move at this stage is just to make things as unpleasant as possible, so that it convinces the club, as you mentioned there, that they're willing to take that gamble. I can equally understand the club deciding that they're unwilling to sanction it, given sort of a player behaving in that way. You mentioned, I think, how sort of towing the line quite impressively, obviously trying to sort of like put the right message out there for fans as well. Pundits are not constrained in the same way. I think I think a lot was noted around some of Alan Shearer's comments over the past couple of weeks, along with, I mean, as I always enjoy, just the endless revisiting of receipts that people brought up around different commentary about different players, and lo and behold, football fans are hypocrites. Is always a fun thing. Actually, I'd forgotten about his back and forth with Michael Owen. For those listeners who are not aware of that, do take a look. It's quite amusing. And the only thing actually I remember around Shearer's comments that kind of bemused me a little bit was kind of the suggestion that 110 million pounds was a belittling fee. I expect if Isak was to leave, that fee would increase, for example. But yeah, it's wild to me that we're in a place in football now where 110 million pounds is seen as a like a disrespectful offer
Yeah.
to a club. Thank you very much for everything around Isak. I'm not going to defend anything else that we can possibly mention there. There's no other strikers, as you said, that are seemingly on the list. I don't think there's going to be a plan to sort of suddenly ask Joe Linton to transform himself back into a into a centre forward either. So that brings us on just finally to the game on Monday evening. I think I mentioned to you at the start, I'm expecting a pretty feral atmosphere. I mean, it's always tough, I think, when Liverpool go up to Newcastle. I'm expecting it to be particularly tough this time, given everything that's gone on with, of course, with Isak. You'd hope the officials are going to be alive to that because I can imagine there's a few, Mr. Jolinton, Mr. Dan Burn, who may want to put themselves about physically in that game. But what are you expecting in that match? It's to me, it's set up to be a pretty ferocious encounter, and given Liverpool's teething issues with the midfield getting up to full fitness, Gravenberch coming back, some of the defensive openness and some of the pace Newcastle have on the counter, I think it could well be one of those Newcastle Liverpool games of old, is what I'm thinking.
Yeah, it's set up for to be potentially a classic, but certainly it's going to be a memorable atmosphere. When the fixture list was released and Newcastle had Aston Villa away and then Liverpool at home as their first two, it looked very, very daunting. And actually, in a perverse sort of way, despite Newcastle's very difficult summer and not having a striker, those two fixtures have turned out to be. If there was one game you were going to pick that you would have Anthony Gordon as a false nine in, I think Villa away wasn't the
Mm.
worst. I mean, it wasn't the sense Newcastle couldn't actually find a winner, but they actually worked really well. The fluid front three worked well together. And then this game against Liverpool on a Monday night under the lights at St James's Park, the Newcastle using the fuel of the summer and the perception they have of how Liverpool have acted and Isak have acted, regardless of what the truths behind that, the feelings of Newcastle supporters towards Isak and towards Liverpool, it all is going to make for it to be a sort of Colosseum like atmosphere, and it will really inspire Newcastle. And although Newcastle won the Carabao Cup final last year, the one team they haven't beaten in the league under Eddie Howe has been Liverpool, and this is the huge opportunity they have to try and do that. A Liverpool side who are reigning champions and have done some wonderful transfer business, but as you said, there may be some teething problems as they're coming to this new season and all those changes that are there. And I think it's yeah, I go into this really expecting Newcastle to come out of the blocks quickly, and then it's how Liverpool sort of respond to that. If Newcastle can score early, I think that it could be a memorable night for Newcastle. But if Liverpool can sort of really backs against the wall maybe for the first 20 minutes, but stop Newcastle with the sort of ferocious press and ferocious intensity, and then find a foothold into the game, then maybe their quality over the course of the 90 minutes can pick Newcastle off, particularly given Newcastle's struggles in the front of goal. But I no, I actually think that in a weird, perverse sort of way, this has turned out to be the ideal fixture for Newcastle.
Yeah, I think certainly for me, my concerns from a Liverpool perspective, aside from the kind of the defending of transitions, which I think we'll get better. I think it's like a case of Gravenberch not being there and McAllister having 2 weeks, I think, of preseason, came back late and is nowhere near sort of fully fit either, and is incredibly important in that unit, integrating the likes of Florian Wirtz into the side as well. I I'm a bit concerned about the physicality aspect of it because I think Newcastle, as I mentioned in the Carabao Cup final, have plenty of players capable of really putting themselves about and are tough to deal with physically. I think Liverpool, we saw that with a much changed Bournemouth side, who are again a really physically impressive side, and that was tough to deal with as well. So, yeah, all set up to be a classic. I think I would be stunned, similar to you, if anything around Isak was concluded by that stage. I suppose the only thing I'm wondering about from Liverpool's perspective now is we'll probably find out this week as well is having let the likes of Darwin Nunez go, having let the likes of Luis Diaz go, Liverpool really actually do need to bring in another forward. And if that's not going to be Alexander Isak, then they probably need to be looking to sort of see what the alternatives are and get moving on those pretty quickly, considering the sort of lack of time that's available in the window. But Chris, thank you so much for coming on, and
No worries.
there's so much to cover, so much we could have covered. I'm sorry to all the listeners and to the viewers if you feel like we haven't sufficiently covered your conspiracy theory around this saga, and if you think actually Liverpool have been, I don't know, in balaclavas behaving terribly all summer. I'm sorry that we've not covered that sufficiently, but we've done our best. And I imagine next time we speak, Chris, it's going to be definitely talking about what was an eventful night in Newcastle on Monday. So thanks so much for coming on.
No problem anytime. Thanks, guys.